Okay, so I feel, given the topic we've been set today, this isn't going to be a panel where we're short of things to say or things to discuss. It's not like there isn't plenty for us to think through when we look at the broader geopolitical agenda. And I'm delighted that for that discussion, we're going to have a group of people that I know are going to have plenty to say and think about. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Antony Jenkins, the founder, chair and CEO of 10 Times Future Technologies Group. Sharon Lewis, the partner and sector lead and head of financial institutions for Hogan Lovells. Alastair Lukies, the chair of the FinTech Alliance. Christoph, Rieche, CEO and co-founder of Iwocca. And Christopher Woolard, the UK FinTech leader and Global Financial Services Regulatory Network chair at EY. And as we think about the panel and what we're going to discuss, I suppose I would like to sort of kick off with an idea that maybe we have to be careful what we wish for. IFGS every year is about the strength of FinTech and the scale and the growth and the dynamism that's coming from the sector. But with that growth, we've seen the industry go from nascent, small disruptor through to providers of absolutely critical infrastructure in our economy, to the provision of services that capture politicians' attention for good, for concern, for thinking about resilience and thinking about the way in which we are serving society or where we may still be leaving parts of business or consumers excluded. And when you scale, all of those things capture political interest and political appetite. And I think that's really what I want us to think about as we kind of go through the discussion today, which is how do we start to grasp the way that politics impacts FinTech and the way that we think about the political interventions in FinTech. Chris, I'm going to kick off with you. You spend a lot of time talking to businesses about everything that's going on right now, and I don't really think we can begin this conversation without probably looking across to America and thinking about how that global political uncertainty is starting to shape the way that the industry is thinking.
Thanks very much. So I think when we think about what's going on in the US at the moment, I mean, we can think of that on at least two levels. So there's clearly a lot of the global headlines that we've seen. There's a lot of the questions around tariffs, around trade, upon wider effect on the world economy. And I won't repeat what you can read in the FT or the Wall Street Journal. I think when we come to think about FinTech, though, specifically, that's almost a microcosm of what we might want to talk about here, which is, on the one hand, there are some really strong signals, I think, towards the industry that have come from the incoming administration. So you've got a lot of political activity that's centred around thinking about digital assets. You've got the work that the Pearce Commission's doing around particularly thinking about blockchain. And I think those things could be very, very significant indeed in terms of thinking about how industry develops within the US. I mean, particularly if you think about the idea of US dollar stable coin regulated in the US, for example. That could be a really big development at federal level, whereas at the moment, you're looking at other jurisdictions like Singapore, for example, who are doing that. So that could be really very, very big. On the other hand, you've only got to look at the data that's coming out in the last couple of weeks around things like consumer confidence, things like unemployment numbers, things like wider investment appetite. What does a 10-year government borrowing rate look like, which has really sort of shot up since January. It says there's a lot of inflationary shocks expected by the market in some way. And all of that makes it quite a difficult environment in which to do business. And then I think you've got the final piece that I think many US firms, certainly a number that we talk to, are very thoughtful about, which is what's actually the long-term impact of some of this. So, I mean, you can make headlines by saying sort of tariffs on, tariffs off within the same week. But as perhaps it's topical today, actually, Mark Carney once said when he was governor at the bank, trust in financial markets arrives on foot and leaves in a Ferrari. And so a lot of those relationships, I think, many people, I think, are very, very thoughtful of what that means for the long term. So what that gives us overall, I think, in certainly the US FinTech market, is quite a cloudy picture right now. And I think, one of the other things that no doubt we'll come on and talk about is, well, okay, what's the effect then on the UK?
I do think that trust question probably applies in this case now, not just to how people think about banks, but arguably about international allies as well, quite possibly. Antony, Alastair, you both must look at this on a daily basis, thinking not just about the US, but also more broadly how geopolitics and the actions of various regional governments are impacting the way that you think about growing your business. How do you think fintechs are having to think about geopolitics? Perhaps if we begin with you.
Sure. And I'd almost go, it's great to be on this panel because I've seen some people I haven't seen for a long time, but Christoph and I and Al and I were talking about this stuff 10 years ago. And it's almost like, what's the point of fintech, right? And I actually think the point of fintech is solving real problems for real people and real businesses and doing it with a sort of singular focus. So I've spent 9 years trying to make core banking better. That's all we've done for 9 years. And so that singular focus on real problems is what we're good at as an industry. And when you set that in the context of everything that's going on and all the noise that's out there, it's like, okay, it is challenging. I agree with everything that Chris said. It's very uncertain in the short term, but equally, who knows what's going to happen in the medium to long term. But in a way, you just can't get distracted by that. As a business, you've got to focus on the things you can control. And it always comes back to me, are you solving a real problem? Do you have a solution that's much better than the existing way of doing it? I like to say 10 times better. And can you actually build and deliver that? Your previous speaker was talking about shipping product. That's what you've got to do if you're in fintech. You've got to have a real problem, you've got to have a better solution, you've got to ship product, you've got to iterate that constantly. And so for me, I think the fundamentals of fintech remain, right? We just have to do it in a more complex environment, and that environment isn't going to change, and we should not expect it to change. It's just going to be the new normal.
Picking up on that new normal, how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, excuse me. First of all, wanted to congratulate Janine and team on a fantastic gathering as always. And it's really nice, as Antony said, we've been involved in this industry a long time, and it feels like the fizz is coming back. I feel like we've had a bit of a lost, not quite a decade, but 8 years where this buzz wasn't there. So I think that's really positive. And that sort of leads me on to my answer, which is ambiguity is the best friend of an entrepreneur. It's the absolute best friend. The greyness, the opaqueness, the volatility, an existential threat. Entrepreneurs love that. Big businesses hate it. Entrepreneurs love it. So if you look at the best companies in the world, they're always built in the downturn, not in the upturn. And so when something like an existential threat, global financial crisis happened, what did we do? We built FinTech. We reacted to it. No politician could talk about bankers in any possible way, so we said, how do we change the narrative? And that's why the UK became the #1 spot, because we had someone in the FCA building a sandbox, we had great leaders talking about technology from a banking perspective, we had entrepreneurs that wanted to solve the world's problems. So I'm super upbeat and delighted that we're back in volatility. Sorry to say that. But actually, for an entrepreneur, it's the best place to be. And just to your introduction, Rebecca, I understand completely your point about, you start with this dream of being a fixer and an entrepreneur, and then if you're successful, you become part of the infrastructure. We should celebrate that, because what we want is multi-time entrepreneurs. And the UK's got this real tall poppy problem, which is, everyone's afraid of being successful because you're going to get your head cut off by the media, and then you're going to buy a house in Magaluf and you're gone. We want fintechs to become scaled up so that the next generation start again, because you're always changing the engine in mid-flight. So I think it's a really big opportunity that we face at the moment. And the UK is trusted around the world because of right touch regulation, rule of law, soft power, all those things will always exist.
That scale journey you talk about is obviously critical, and the UK has had many successes. There are challenges to the system, but it's absolutely imperative to have the support from investors. And so, Christoph, from your perspective, how do you think investors are thinking about fintech's growth potential, how they think about the investment landscape being impacted by current geopolitical headwinds, if I can refer to them as that?
Well, first of all, really good points from both of you. My heart was sort of beating while you were speaking about entrepreneurs and how we deal with crisis. Well, the much-awaited Klarna IPO got pulled. I think that basically tells the story. Whenever there's high uncertainty, investors are looking for the door. And looking for the door might also just mean that valuation might drop quite significantly as they do in stock markets. So for private companies, it's the same as for public companies. And then there are some great companies that will not have the funds to grind and continue. That's sort of the sad story. But then there are other great companies that have the funds, and they will just grind harder with the funds that they have. And while larger companies will be paralyzed by the uncertainty in the markets, as you pointed out, entrepreneurs are thriving in uncertainty, and are just putting their heads down and are working harder with their team and making money go much further than they might do otherwise. So it is generally for those companies that have funds, it's a great environment to innovate faster than incumbents and expand the edge that they have.
Other views on the investor landscape from members of the panel before we think about the UK strength?
Yeah, I think everyone talks about this growth gap. You know, very easy to raise your first couple of rounds, but where do we get the $50, $100 million checks from? It's well discussed. The LSE is an issue. Why have we got a stock market that used to be a jewel in the crown that isn't providing liquidity? People aren't wanting to list here. You can look at the fact that the LSE market itself is only 3% of the entire group's revenue. So why would you as a CEO be investing in that area? But yeah, it links to our culture as well, which is this tall poppy thing that I keep talking about. You know, a lot of pension funds will go in and they'll say to government, absolutely, we want to see more innovation, and then they'll go and put all the money into real estate again. So I think having an active and exciting stock exchange fixes so many of the other issues, because you can see a journey to liquidity, you can incentivize your staff with liquid stock, and so until we fix that, I think this growth gap is going to continue to be an issue for us.
I want to kind of look on that question now of UK strengths and whether it's the funding markets or access to capital for firms. What was clear for anyone that was in Washington last week for World Bank Week is the competition to attract FinTech and to attract the investment, the talent, the business. And that's regulatory competition, it's government focus. It was astonishing to see kind of so many international regulators competing for that kind of time with the industry in a way that you wouldn't have seen 10 years ago. It feels like that should be a good thing, but Sharon, I wonder how you feel about whether the geopolitics and the rivalry we're seeing between nations, is there a risk that it makes growth more fractious? Is there a risk that it brings a challenge to the sector as well as kind of the positive side of it?
Yeah, I mean, there are clearly challenges. I think they've been discussed well by the panel so far. But I think with challenge, you also get opportunity. I remember in 2016 coming off the plane, the Brexit vote, and calling my husband from Singapore in distress. And he actually said, well, you know, there's always good. Nothing is as good as bad as you think it's going to be. And I think that for this sector, I think that actually what is happening in the US is propelling our regulators in the UK and in Europe to do better and to do faster. And I think that is something which is hugely positive. The fact that also the US is now focusing on digital assets in a way that it was very against, again, is providing a clearer environment. Many clients were worried about actually moving forward in the digital asset space because of the long arm of the US regulator. I think that is subsiding. People are really ready to go and to motor. And I would say, you know, I have been part of this industry for a very long time, along with people on this panel, there was always time where you'd say, well, nothing's happening, it's too slow, it's too difficult to get funding, etc., etc. But quite clearly, COVID propelled our fintech industry. It's become, in the retail banking space, almost mainstream. And I'd like to think that what's going on in the US, perhaps it's not COVID, but akin to COVID, might propel fintech actually into the wholesale and the investment bank market, which is really where it needs to go.
Can I just say, I think I agree with everything that you said. To add, fintech is an incredibly broad category, right? Most of my clients aren't in the UK. Almost none of my investors aren't in the UK, but I happen to base my business in the UK, partly because I'm from the UK. So, yes, if you're in a lending business like Christoph, if you're in a retail, front-facing neobank, yes, those things matter. But we should remember that it's not just about what's on the ground here. It's about what we can do globally. And I still think we have massive assets as a country here, whether it's the quality of the education system, the rule of law, all of those things, and the fact that this, where we sit here in the city, I always find when I do these talks every year, you come here and you just feel this sense of history that goes back hundreds of years. People were innovating in the city, 1,000 years ago. This is not a new thing. This is what we're good at, and we're good at because we've got concentration of expertise across the legal system, accountancy, financing, trading. All of those things are clustered here, and so we've got a sort of huge number of advantages. I accept what Al says completely about the scale-up gap. That is a real problem for this country. But it doesn't mean that we can't continue to punch above our weight in the global environment. And before we beat ourselves up too much, we must remember the US market, the US economy is about 6 times the size of ours. Their capital markets are massive compared to ours. And there's a culture in the US of individuals investing their own money. There's much more retail investment-based thing there, whereas in this country, people basically, if they're saving, they put it in a bank or an ISA, or they might put it in their pension or whatever. There's not that same sort of liquidity in the market here. So it's a problem we've got to solve, but we always compare ourselves to the US. We should think about where we've got real strength compared to the US as well.
Absolutely, and the strengths of the ecosystem are very clear, but I suppose it's thinking about that question of, as regulators compete to match the strength and maximise the benefits in their own economy, particularly for global businesses and global fintechs, does that create a challenge? I think it was the head of the MAS last week that said very clearly, as we drive innovation in our sector, we need to ensure in designing regimes we preserve interoperability, connectedness and resilience. And I suppose when we're in a global trade war, if we can call it that, does that desire for kind of domestic focus from politicians risk fragmenting some of those qualities?
So, if I maybe take that, I mean, yes, of course there's that risk there, and I think that sense of interoperability is incredibly important to the global economy. But I just want to come back to something Antony said in his first comments. I think as a sector, when we think about fintech, yes, there's clearly a risk posed by some of this. But on the other hand, there's also jobs to be done. And I think one of the things that we have to accept as a reality is, we can see greater global fragmentation. We are seeing more national and regional agendas setting what policy looks like. If you're running a global business, that means actually the operating environment is becoming more complex. But on the other hand, people need to solve that. You can't just sit there and say, okay, that's going to mean more cost and more inefficiency. You're going to have to think about ways of actually bringing together, whether it's very large companies or whether it's, much more agile fintechs operating across multiple jurisdictions. There's got to be ways of using technology, of using skills, of using things actually we are very, very good at here in the UK to actually solve some of those problems. So yes, it's in some ways it's not great, but in other ways I think there are significant opportunities there.
I would add to this that less regulation will foster more innovation because you can iterate faster than if you're held back by regulation. And I can give you a tangible example in small business lending. Why do you need a consumer credit license to give a small business loan to a sole trader? There's just regulation that is just not fit for purpose at all. Why is this not just removed and sole traders exempt and treated as businesses if they turn over £100,000? And I think in this country and in Europe in general, we have the tendency to overthink regulation and to over-regulate to protect consumers of various different sophistications the same way. And I think that is holding back the much-needed growth that we need in the UK and in Europe. And I think the US has done that a lot better over the last decade or two.
Yeah, I think I always like to look at, for real examples. So we talk about a volatile world. In the mid-50s, someone came up with the idea of the fact that a bank card needed to be able to be used in lots of different stores, and so Visa and MasterCard were born. And since then we've had Vietnam, the Cold War, the financial crises, many of them. So there's been more volatility over those years. MasterCard's a $500 billion company, Visa's a $750 billion company, and they continue to grow. So whatever's going on in the world, monetary flows will find a way of making it work.
Yeah, and I think actually also you're quite right about, we can talk about deglobalization, fragmentation, and the like, but at the same time, it is pushing the regulators, businesses, to act and to find solutions. And one of the topics that's been very prevalent over the last while is defence. Defence is going to require finance. Defence is going to require fintechs. Defence is going to require our regulators to think as to how to facilitate the increasing involvement of the private sector. And I completely concur with Antony. Encouraging, government, as was said this morning, is not there to do, but it's there to facilitate, to provide the guardrails. And I think the guardrails need to facilitate and to permit people to invest and to encourage them to take risks. The other problem in this country and in Europe is demographics. People are going to have to invest for their old age. Government does not have the solution, and FinTech, in my view, is centred to that.
Sharon, thank you. I think those are some fantastic final reflections to finish on for this panel, particularly as we think about the way that FinTech can address some of those new challenges that we've all been looking at and discussing through the course of this morning. So thank you very much to all of our panelists today, and thank you for joining us for the session.